Welcome to this deep dive, something you've been wanting to explore for a while now. We're looking at anti-intellectualism in America and whether there's any hope of changing things. We're going deep into a 2017 research article. It's called The Dynamics and Political Implications of Anti-Intellectualism in the United States. It's the American Politics Research Journal.
Yeah, it's a fascinating study. It gets right to the heart of how distrust of experts is shaping, political beliefs.
Okay, so first things first, how do we even define anti-intellectualism, like in this context? Um, it feels like it's more nuanced than just not liking smart people.
Absolutely. It's not about, shunning academics or hating book clubs or anything. Anti-intellectualism in this study, it's a measurable negative sentiment towards scientists and experts. So think about it like this. George Wallace, back in 68, he dismissed experts as pointy-headed intellectuals, that
Uh,
kind of rhetoric, right? Aimed at discrediting expert opinion. That's what this research is analyzing.
So they're looking at how those attitudes about experts actually influence political opinions.
Exactly. So to measure this, right, this anti-intellectualism, the researchers used data from two sources. One was the General Social Survey, the GSS, which has been tracking Americans' views on all sorts of things for decades, including science. The other was a study from the Center for the Study of Political Psychology, the CSPP, and it focused on whether people trust ordinary folks more than experts.
Okay, so these surveys provide a window into how views on science and experts are changing over time. So that gives us a foundation for understanding how anti-intellectualism ebbs and flows.
Yeah, precisely. And what they found is it's quite interesting. The study points out this trend. Anti-intellectualism exists across the political spectrum, but it's been more common among conservatives since the 1990s.
Really, more prevalent among conservatives. That's interesting because I feel like I hear anti-expert sentiment from both sides of the aisle, these days.
Right. And it's not limited to one side. In fact, the research also shows that trust in the scientific community among liberals, while higher than conservatives, is only moderately positive. But a researcher named Gauchat, he found that among conservatives, trust in science has actually been declining for decades. So while it exists across the political spectrum, it has become a particularly strong force within conservative thought.
So it's not just that conservatives are more likely to be anti-intellectual,
Yeah.
but that this sentiment has been growing within that group over time. That raises a question for me. Why the 1990s? Did something happen then that might explain this shift?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it speaks to the need for more research, to be honest. The study itself doesn't delve into the specific causes, but it does highlight that anti-intellectualism has appeared throughout American political history.
Give me an example.
Okay, well, think about Theodore Roosevelt. During the Progressive Era, he strategically distanced himself from intellectuals, playing up his, rugged, outdoorsy persona, in contrast to those he portrayed as stuffy academics.
I never thought about it that way, but that makes sense. It's a way of aligning yourself with the, everyday person
Yeah.
and against the perceived elitism of intellectuals. And it sounds like a tactic that still resonates today.
Absolutely. Politicians tapping into anti-intellectual sentiment is not a new thing at all. Take George H.W. Bush, for instance. During his campaign against Michael Dukakis, he subtly linked Dukakis to intellectuals who were perceived as looking down on popular religion.
So even back then, there was a strategic advantage in appealing to this distrust of experts. But why does it work? What is it about anti-intellectualism that resonates with voters?
It's a complex question, but the research gives us some clues. One of the key takeaways is that anti-intellectualism, it isn't just a stand-in for ideology. It has its own power to shape opinions. For example, the study found that anti-intellectualism can actually predict people's opinions on things like climate change and nuclear power, even after controlling for their political leanings and demographics.
Wait, so even if you take into account someone's political party and background, if they have strong anti-intellectual attitudes, they're more likely to reject what the majority of scientists are saying. That's a big deal.
Yeah, it is. It suggests that anti-intellectualism isn't simply a reflection of other beliefs. It has a distinct and measurable effect on how people form opinions, particularly on complex and often controversial issues like climate change.
So how does this play out in the political arena? Does anti-intellectualism actually influence who people vote for?
That's precisely what the researchers wanted to find out, and their findings were quite compelling. They discovered a link between anti-intellectualism and support for certain politicians, even after accounting for factors like sexism, racism, and authoritarianism.
That's really interesting. It seems like there's a pattern here. Politicians who criticize experts or appeal to a distrust of intellectualism seem to benefit from those attitudes among voters. But you mentioned that this isn't just about ideology. It's about this distinct force of anti-intellectualism. Can you elaborate on that? Like, what makes this sentiment so powerful?
Well, one theory is that it taps into this deep-seated desire for simplicity and certainty. In a world that often feels increasingly complex and ambiguous, experts with their nuanced perspectives and data-driven arguments can sometimes challenge those simple narratives.
Right. If someone is looking for clear-cut answers and solutions, experts can seem like they're complicating things unnecessarily, and it's easier to dismiss them as out of touch than to grapple with the complexity they're presenting.
Exactly. And in a world where we're constantly bombarded with information, it can be tempting to rely on gut feelings and emotional reasoning
Hmm.
rather than engaging in the effortful process of critically evaluating evidence.
Speaking of effort,
Yeah.
you mentioned that the study looked at potential ways to mitigate anti-intellectual attitudes. That's something I was particularly interested in, especially since I've wondered if education might be the key.
Right. It's a common assumption, isn't it, that if people just had more knowledge, they'd be more trusting of experts. But the research found that education and knowledge, while important, didn't have a consistent impact on anti-intellectualism.
That's surprising. If more knowledge doesn't necessarily lead to more trust in experts, what does?
Well, the study points to a less obvious factor, verbal intelligence.
Now that's intriguing. What exactly does verbal intelligence mean in this context? I know it has to do with language skills.
Yeah.
But how does that connect to anti-intellectualism?
You're right. Verbal intelligence, it does involve the ability to understand and use language effectively, but it goes beyond just vocabulary and grammar. It's about being able to analyze information, to identify logical fallacies, and to construct well-reasoned arguments.
Ah, so it's not just about how much you know, but how well you can process and critically engage with information. That makes sense.
Exactly. And the study found that individuals with high verbal intelligence were less likely to hold anti-intellectual views, regardless of their political beliefs.
So regardless of whether someone leans left or right, their ability to think critically about information seems to play a role in how they view experts. I'm really starting to see how this all connects. But if verbal intelligence is so crucial, how do we foster it, especially in young people who are still developing their critical thinking skills?
Yeah, that's a question that we'll explore a little bit further in a bit. But first, let's delve into some of the specific ways that anti-intellectualism can manifest in political discourse. We've touched on some historical examples, but there are modern parallels that are really fascinating. For instance, think about the language used in some political campaigns.
You mentioned the language used in political campaigns. Are you talking about those like us versus them narratives that pit regular folks against the so-called elites?
Exactly. It's a common tactic, and it often plays on that anti-intellectual sentiment. By portraying intellectuals or experts as out of touch or even hostile to the interests of everyday people, it creates the sense of suspicion and distrust.
You know, it makes me think about the 2016 election and the Brexit campaign. Both of those events seem to tap into this wave of anti-establishment and often anti-intellectual sentiment.
Yeah, that's a great observation, and the research actually delves into that directly. The study found that anti-intellectualism was a significant factor in support for both Donald Trump and the decision to leave the EU.
I remember those campaigns being filled with rhetoric that, dismissed expert opinions and appealed to emotion over evidence. It's interesting to see that the researchers actually found a measurable connection between those attitudes and the outcome of those events.
Yeah, it's crucial to remember that these were complex events influenced by many factors, but the role of anti-intellectualism shouldn't be ignored. The research suggests that it went beyond just being correlated with those outcomes. It actually helped predict them.
So it's not just a coincidence that these movements and figures who often criticize experts gain traction. Their message seemed to resonate with people who already held anti-intellectual views, and that in turn may have influenced how they voted.
That's right, and it highlights the importance of understanding how these attitudes function in the real world. It's not just an abstract concept. Anti-intellectualism has real implications for how we make decisions as a society, from who we elect to how we address critical issues.
And it circles back to that question we were discussing earlier. Can anything be done to counter these attitudes? If If education alone isn't enough, are we just stuck with this growing tide of distrust in experts?
Not necessarily. The study's finding about verbal intelligence offers a glimmer of hope. If we can equip people with the tools to think critically about information, to discern between credible and questionable sources, it it could make a real difference.
It's like building a defense system against misinformation and manipulation. The more people who can, confidently navigate the information landscape, the better off we'll all be.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just individual empowerment. It also has implications for the health of our democracy. When people are equipped to evaluate evidence and make informed decisions, it strengthens the foundation of a well-functioning society.
So it's not just about protecting ourselves from being misled. It's about ensuring that our collective decision-making processes are grounded in sound judgment and critical thinking.
Exactly. This research underscores the importance of ongoing dialogue in education about the value of expertise and critical thinking. We need to find ways to make these skills more accessible and appealing,
Yeah.
especially to young people who are still developing their worldviews.
You mentioned earlier that we'd come back to the question of how to cultivate verbal intelligence.
Mm.
Any insights from the research on that front? It feels like a daunting task, especially in today's media environment where misinformation is so rampant.
It's definitely a challenge, but the research suggests that there are approaches that can make a difference. For example, encouraging reading comprehension skills from a young age can help build a foundation for critical thinking.
That makes sense. Reading, complex texts requires you to analyze arguments,
Ah,
to identify underlying assumptions, and evaluate the strength of the evidence presented. It's like a mental workout for those critical thinking muscles.
precisely. And it's not just about reading. Engaging in thoughtful discussions where different perspectives are presented and respectfully debated can also help hone those skills.
So creating environments where people feel safe to express their opinions, to challenge assumptions, and
Yeah.
to grapple with complex ideas without fear of judgment or ridicule. That feels crucial, especially in a time when polarization often shuts down meaningful dialogue.
You're right. Fostering a culture of intellectual curiosity and open-mindedness is essential. It's about creating spaces where questioning and critical analysis are valued, not dismissed as elitist or out of touch.
I appreciate you bringing this research to my attention. It's been a fascinating journey exploring the history of anti-intellectualism, how it's playing out in contemporary politics, and most importantly, what we can do about it. It's given me a lot to think about.
I'm glad you found it insightful. And remember, this is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Anti-intellectualism is a multifaceted phenomenon with deep roots and complex implications. But by understanding its dynamics, we can start to address it more effectively.
As we've been talking, I've been thinking about my own experiences with anti-intellectualism. It's made me realize that it's it's not always as overt as we might think. Sometimes it shows up in subtle ways, like dismissing someone's expertise because they don't fit a certain stereotype,
Yeah.
or assuming that complex issues have simple solutions.
Those are great examples, and they highlight the importance of being aware of our own biases and assumptions. We all have them, and it's crucial to examine how they might be influencing our views on knowledge and expertise.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the pervasiveness of anti-intellectualism and the many forms it can take. But it's also given me hope that through education, critical thinking, and open dialogue, we can start to shift the tide.
I agree. It's a journey, not a destination. And every step we take toward value and knowledge, expertise, and critical thinking is a step in the right direction.
Well said. Now I'm curious what resonated most with you from our exploration today. What insights stood out or sparked new questions in your mind?
What struck me most was the reminder that anti-intellectualism isn't simply about a lack of education or intelligence. It's often rooted in deeper anxieties about complexity, uncertainty, and the perceived elitism of those who hold specialized knowledge. And that realization, it helps me approach these conversations with more empathy and understanding.
I appreciate that perspective. It's a good reminder that behind every anti-intellectual sentiment there's a person with their own experiences, fears, and motivations.
Yeah.
And while we may not always agree, understanding those underlying factors can help us engage in more productive dialogue.
And that dialogue, that willingness to engage with different perspectives
Yeah.
and to grapple with complexity, that's where the real hope lies. It's how we move beyond simplistic narratives and toward more nuanced and informed understandings of the world.
Well, on that hopeful note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we do, I want to leave our listener with a final thought-provoking question to ponder. Given everything we've discussed, how can we as individuals and as a society encourage the development of verbal intelligence and critical thinking, especially among young people? Like what steps can we take to foster a greater appreciation for knowledge and expertise in a world that often seems to reward simplicity over nuance?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And while there's, no easy answer, the research does offer some valuable insights. We've talked about the importance of reading comprehension and fostering thoughtful discussions, but there's so much more we can do.
Like what? What are some concrete steps we could take?
Well, for starters, we can be more mindful of the media we consume and share. Are we exposing ourselves to diverse perspectives, or are we stuck in echo chambers that reinforce our existing biases? Are we critically evaluating the information we encounter? Or are we passively accepting whatever fits our preconceived notions?
That's a great point. It's so easy to get, caught up in the flow of information,
Yeah.
especially online. But taking a step back to ask ourselves those questions, to really consider the source and the potential biases at play, that's crucial.
It is. And beyond our own media consumption, we can encourage critical thinking in our communities, whether it's through book clubs, local discussion groups, or even just engaging in thoughtful conversations with friends and family. We can create spaces where people feel comfortable questioning assumptions and exploring different viewpoints.
I love that idea of creating those safe spaces for intellectual exploration. It reminds me of something you said earlier about fostering a culture of intellectual curiosity.
Yeah.
It's not just about acquiring knowledge, it's about embracing the process of inquiry, of constantly asking why and seeking deeper understanding.
You've hit the nail on the head. And that curiosity, that desire to learn and grow, it's contagious. When we model that behavior for young people and we show them that learning can be exciting and rewarding, we plant the seeds for, a lifelong love of knowledge.
That's a beautiful thought. It makes me think about the power of mentorship and role modeling. We can all play a part in fostering intellectual curiosity in the next generation, whether it's through, formal mentorship programs or simply by engaging young people in thoughtful conversations about the world around them.
Absolutely. And let's not forget the importance of supporting our educational institutions. Teachers play a vital role in nurturing critical thinking skills, but they need resources and support to do so effectively. Advocating for policies that prioritize education and critical thinking is an essential part of this effort.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. It's given me a new perspective on anti-intellectualism, its impact on our society, and most importantly, the potential we have to counter it. It's clear that it's not a simple fix. It requires a multifaceted approach that involves individual awareness, community engagement, and systemic change.
I couldn't agree more. It's a journey that requires ongoing effort and commitment from all of us. But the stakes are high. The future of informed decision-making and ultimately the health of our democracy depends on our ability to cultivate a society that values knowledge, expertise, and critical thinking.
Well said. I think that's the perfect note to end on, a call to action for all of us to be more mindful, more engaged, and more committed to fostering a culture of intellectual curiosity and critical thinking. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and complex world of anti-intellectualism. We hope it's sparked some new ideas and inspired you to continue exploring this important topic. And remember, as always, keep diving deep.